Picture a conference room on the 14th floor of a tech company that had until very recently considered itself untouchable. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls, the kind that were supposed to signal transparency, but mostly just meant everyone could watch you sweat through your shirt in HD. A whiteboard stretched across the far wall, covered in numbers that several very important people were pretending to understand. A speakerphone sat in the center of the table like a grenade with a loose pin. Sitting around that table, Sandra, the CFO, who had the particular talent of looking completely composed while calculating exactly how badly someone had just damaged the company. Marcus, the controller, who had not blinked in approximately 4 minutes. Two people from legal who had shown up so fast it suggested they had been waiting for this call. And at the head of the table, Thomas, the CEO, whose jaw was doing that slow grinding thing that meant whatever he was about to say had been filtered through about 6 layers of corporate restraint before it reached his mouth. They were all waiting for Derek. Derek, my boss. Derek, who was on a plane. Derek, who had approved a commission structure that was quietly hemorrhaging company money. Derek, who had signed off on a contract amendment that a vice president had used to artificially inflate his sales numbers by roughly 30%. Derek, who for the better part of a year been accepting credit for a contracts department that he could not, as it was now becoming very clear, actually run. I was not in that room. I was at my desk 2 floors down, finishing a certification module, occasionally glancing at the ceiling, the way you do when you can feel something large and structural shifting directly above your head. And here is the part that will either satisfy you completely or make you furious on my behalf. Possibly both. I had done everything right, every single thing, and I had done it on purpose. I was hired about 3 years before any of this happened to build a contracts department from scratch. Not inherit one, not restructure one, build one. From a blank room and a job description that was more wishful thinking than actual instruction. The company was a tech startup that had been scaling fast enough that contracts were being drafted by whoever happened to be standing near the printer at the time. Sales reps were writing terms, engineers were modifying agreements. Someone in marketing had at one point approved a licensing clause. It was chaos dressed up in startup optimism, and they needed someone to come in and make it stop. That someone was me. My boss was a man I will call Derek. Derek worked out of the San Francisco office. I was in Chicago. The time zone gap was 2 hours, and the communication gap was considerably wider. In our first month working together, Derek and I spoke 4 times. 2 of those conversations were about scheduling future conversations that never happened. Derek was the kind of manager who was very good at being present in the specific moments when things were going well and very difficult to locate when they were not. He had a gift for the high-level summary, for the kind of language that sounds strategic but does not actually commit to anything, and for appearing on calls with his camera off at a quality that made it genuinely unclear whether he was in an office or a parking garage. What Derek was not good at was contracts. He did not know commission structures, he did not know termination clauses, he did not know the difference between an SLA and an NDA in any practical operational sense. He knew the vocabulary, he could deploy the vocabulary with some confidence in a meeting, but the actual architecture of a functioning contracts department, the policies, the templates, the approval chains, the review timelines, the version control, the compliance checkpoints, all of that was built by me in Chicago, largely without him, which was fine. I loved the work. There is a specific kind of satisfaction in building something from nothing, in watching a process go from non-existent to invisible, which is the goal. You want contracts to be invisible. You want them to be so solid, so clearly structured, so reliably handled that no one ever has to think about them. That is the mark of a department running the way it should. And by the end of year 1, ours was. The company brought in consultants to overhaul 5 departments: procurement, finance, sales operations, product, HR. They were thorough, expensive, and necessary. They worked their way through each department with the methodical energy of people who charge by the hour and know it. They did not touch contracts. They did not touch contracts because there was nothing to fix. My manager, Priya from HR, pulled me aside after the consultant review wrapped up and told me the feedback had been, and I am quoting here, remarkably clean. Then, the company sent me to the Bahamas for a week, paid, no agenda, no deliverables, just a thank you, sincerely meant from an organization that understood what had just not gone wrong because of the work I had put in. I came back from that trip tan, rested, and confident enough to do something I had been building toward for months. I asked Derek for a raise to director level. The call was at 9 a.m. his time, 11 mine. He had his camera off, as usual. I had mine on, which I had decided was a statement. I laid out my case, the way I'd been taught to do it. Current responsibilities, business impact, market benchmarks, tenure, the consultant outcome, the Bahamas trip as organizational acknowledgement of value. I was thorough, I was calm, I had a document prepared. Derek listened. There was a long pause after I finished, the kind of pause that is not thoughtful, it is stalling. "I just don't think you're there yet," he said. I asked him to define there. "I'll send you a list," he said, "things you need to demonstrate to move to that level." The list arrived 2 days later. I printed it out and read it at my desk with a cup of coffee going cold next to my keyboard. And then I read it again, slower this time, because I needed to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Every single item on that list was something I was already doing, not a version of it, not an adjacent skill, the exact things. Every responsibility he had outlined as the threshold for director was a task I had been performing without the title, without the pay, for the better part of a year. But here is the line that crystallized everything, buried in the third paragraph, written in the flat, hedging language of someone who had not meant to be this honest. A director-level position would require more direct oversight from executive leadership, which would change the current reporting structure significantly. Read that again. He was telling me, in writing, that promoting me would cost him credit, that as long as I was a manager reporting to him, everything I built was his to present upward. The moment I became a director with my own lane of visibility into executive leadership, the scaffolding he had been standing on would become transparent. I sat with that for a long time. That night, I called my friend Caleb, who had been in corporate environments long enough to have strong opinions about exactly this kind of situation. "You have 2 moves," he said. "Leave now or shut up and stay. There's no third option." I told him I thought there was. He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do something that makes me nervous, aren't you?" Here is what you have to understand about malicious compliance before I tell you what happened next. It is not sabotage. It is not negligence. It is the purest form of professional obedience available to someone who has been told explicitly what their job is. Derek had told me I was overstepping my role as a manager. He had told me through his list that the director-level work I was performing was not mine to claim. He had given me, in writing, a definition of exactly what a manager in my position was supposed to do. And I decided, with great sincerity and absolutely no apology, to do exactly that. Nothing more. What happened next went bad faster than I could have scripted it if I had tried. I want to describe the morning I walked back from my boss's invisible office and chose my lane. I printed out the manager job description. I am not being metaphorical. I physically printed it in 12-point font on a single sheet of paper, and I taped it to the corkboard above my desk where I could see it from my chair. My colleague, Natalie, who sat 2 desks over and had watched me build the department from the first template, looked at the paper, looked at me, and said nothing for a long moment. "That's a lot of white space," she finally said. She was right. The manager description, the actual defined scope of the role Derek had essentially told me to return to, had about 40% of the responsibilities I had been carrying. The rest, the executive-facing reviews, the cross-departmental contract strategy, the vendor escalations, the compliance oversight, the training of new sales hires on contract terms, all of it lived above the line Derek had drawn. So I stepped back behind it. I want to be precise about what that looked like because this is the part people sometimes misread as laziness or spite. It was neither. I showed up every day. I answered every email within my scope on the same day it arrived. I processed every contract that came through the standard workflow. I documented everything meticulously. I was, by every measurable metric defined by the job description taped to my wall, performing at the top of the role. What I stopped doing was carrying Derek. The first sign that something was shifting came from the sales team. Not a dramatic sign, a small one, the kind you notice if you have been paying attention to the rhythm of a business for a year, and I had. Sales targets for Q3 started coming in light, not catastrophically, but consistently, and in patterns that a person who understood contract terms would have recognized immediately. Certain deal structures that I had previously flagged and quietly corrected were now moving through without that correction. Commission agreements were going out with language that any senior contracts person would have caught in a first pass. Derek, it turned out, did not catch them on any pass. The sales team was not malicious, mostly. They were doing what sales teams do, finding the path of least resistance to closing. When the person reviewing their agreements actually understood the downstream consequences of a termination clause, that path had some friction built into it. Now, it did not. Contracts started moving faster. The sales team loved it. They hit their short-term numbers with an enthusiasm that should have been the first warning sign. Nobody flagged it to me because it was not my lane. Then the product team called an emergency budget meeting. I heard about this secondhand from Marcus, the controller, who had developed the habit of walking past my desk on his way to the coffee machine and delivering information in the studied casual tone of someone who was not technically gossiping. "Products in a situation," he said one afternoon, refilling his mug. "Something about a term in an enterprise agreement that's going to impact our rollout budget by about $200,000. I nodded. I asked no follow-up questions. "Derek approved it," Marcus added, and then he walked away. I sat very still for a moment. Then I returned to the certification module I had been working through, a contract law credential I had been slowly completing during the chunks of my day that were now genuinely unscheduled. I had a test block in 2 weeks. I was on pace to finish early. The product situation resolved itself expensively. The company ate the cost. Derek was on several calls about it that I was not invited to. I heard the walls had been thin enough that his tone on one of those calls was described by Natalie as not great. Meanwhile, the commission structure issue was quietly compounding. This is where I have to give you some technical context because the numbers matter. The company's sales commission plan paid out on closed contracts, which is standard. What is not standard, and what any experienced contracts person would have built protections against, is paying commission on contracts that contain termination for convenience clauses at 30 or 60 days. Because if a client can walk in 2 months with no penalty, and sales has already been paid commission on that deal as if it were a 12-month commitment, the company is paying people for revenue it is not guaranteed to collect. Derek had let this structure stand. More precisely, Derek had let the sales team push amended language into the commission schedule that removed the safeguards I had originally drafted. The changes had gone through under his signature. By the time Marcus and Sandra, the CFO, started pulling the thread, the liability was not small. I want to be honest with you about something. There was a moment, somewhere around week 6 of this period, when I sat at my desk at 4:15 in the afternoon, my certification material on one screen and a very clean, very empty contracts queue on the other, listening to what sounded like Derek's third tense phone call of the day, and I felt something I was not entirely prepared for. Not satisfaction, not exactly. Something more complicated than that. The specific hollow ache of watching a thing you built start to come apart, knowing exactly which bolt was missing and why, and choosing to not reach for the wrench. Because the only way to protect the company would have been to step back into work that was not mine, work that Derek had told me, in writing, was not mine, work that came with no title, no additional compensation, and the guarantee that any success would travel upward under someone else's name. I closed that feeling like a tab I did not need open, and I went back to studying. What happened next was not something I engineered. I want to be clear about that. I did not set a trap, I did not manipulate anyone or manufacture a crisis. What I did was exactly what I had been told to do, and the crisis was already there, waiting, held in place by someone who did not actually understand the structure he had been taking credit for. But there was one moment where I did intervene. One, and it is important that you understand why. Brendan was a VP on the sales side. He was charming in the specific way of people who have learned that charm is a tool, and he used it consistently and without real warmth. He had been with the company about 18 months, had hit his numbers in a way that looked great on a slide deck, and had developed a habit of pushing contract amendments through in the final days of a quarter. I had flagged his methodology twice in my previous role. Both times, the flags had gone into the director-level review process that now did not include me. And in month 2 of my scaled-back existence, Brendan put through an amendment that was going to do something specific and damaging. It was going to let him recognize revenue on a deal that had not actually closed in any meaningful sense. The client had signed a letter of intent. The amendment reframed the LOI as a binding agreement for commission purposes, which would inflate his Q4 numbers by enough to affect his bonus structure and the company's reported sales performance. I looked at that amendment for a long time. The manager job description taped to my wall did not include executive-level contract review. It did include flagging amendments that constituted a compliance violation. I flagged it, once, in writing, to Marcus and Sandra, copied to legal, with a precise 2-paragraph explanation of what the amendment did and why it was a problem. I did not escalate. I did not follow up. I sent the flag and returned to my desk. Marcus forwarded it to Sandra. Sandra walked into legal's office and closed the door. Legal called the CFO. The CFO called the CEO. Thomas, the CEO, showed up on the 14th floor at 9:15 the following morning in the particular way of a CEO who has decided that the elevator is not fast enough. He pulled Sandra, Marcus, and Legal into the glass conference room. He got Derek on the phone. I learned most of what happened in that room from Natalie, who had a sight line to the glass wall and the particular gift of being able to read body language through partial blinds. Derek's voice, she told me, was audible at points. Not the words, just the register of someone explaining themselves to people who are not asking to be persuaded, only to be informed. Thomas ended the call at 10:47. What came out of that room was not a single dramatic verdict. It was a process, and processes take time. An internal review of the commission structure, a forensic look at the contract amendments from the previous quarter, a conversation between Legal and Brendan that Brendan did not enjoy, and a quiet, sustained deterioration of Derek's standing with the executive team that expressed itself in the way these things usually do. Fewer invitations, shorter emails, a quality of engagement on calls that suggested the room had already reached a conclusion and was waiting for the paperwork to catch up. I heard, through the particular grapevine that exists in every office building regardless of how professional everyone insists on being, that Derek had been seen squeezing a stress ball in a meeting, that he had used language in a Zoom that required someone to mute themselves, that he had, on one occasion, sent an email at 11:45 at night that contained 4 exclamation points and no actual information. I was leaving the office at 4:30 most days to get to the gym before the after-work crowd arrived. I had passed the first certification exam. I had registered for the second. About a month after the 14th floor meeting, Derek gave me a bonus, 7%. It appeared in my account with no email, no call, no conversation, just the number and a transaction date. I understood what it was. It was not gratitude. It was not recognition. It was an invitation, delivered in the only language available to someone who could not afford to say the actual words. It was Derek asking me, without asking, to come back, to pick up the weight again, to be the structure he could stand on while making sure I never got tall enough to be seen. I acknowledged the bonus in a brief professional email. I thanked him for the recognition. I told him I was continuing to focus on delivering strong work within my role. I did not take anything back. 6 months later, I submitted 10 days of PTO under our unlimited policy. I went somewhere warm. I read 2 books. I did not check Slack. When I came back, I was included in a round of layoffs. I want to say that slowly because it deserves the weight of it. A company I had served with genuine loyalty, a department I had built from nothing, a body of work that had been quietly holding things together long after I had stopped being its visible author. And the outcome was a box of desk items and an exit meeting with HR that lasted 22 minutes. The irony is that I understand the math. Layoffs are rarely personal. They are usually the financial expression of accumulated bad decisions reaching a line on a spreadsheet. And a number of bad decisions had, in the preceding months, accumulated. Some of them had my fingerprints on them in the form of absent oversight. Some of them were structural. Some of them had Derek's name on the approval line. I do not know exactly what happened to Derek after I left. I know the division continued to struggle. I know that the commission structure required a significant renegotiation with the sales team that took the better part of a quarter. I know that 2 people were hired after my departure to cover responsibilities that had, apparently, been attached to one person's job description without anyone fully mapping that out until the person was gone. I took 3 months off. Not by plan, initially, but it became intentional quickly. I studied. I finished the 2nd certification. I started on a 3rd. I ran in the mornings and cooked actual meals and had the particular disorienting experience of sleeping 8 hours on a consistent basis and discovering that I had opinions that were not work-related. And then I took a new job, 35% more than I had been making, contracts director, the title I had earned 3 years before without collecting it. A manager who in the first week asked me what I needed from her to do my job well and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. Here is the thing about this story that I think about more than the bonus, more than the compliance, more than the layoff. It is the Bahamas trip. The company sent me to the Bahamas because the work was good. The work was provably, independently, externally verified as good. And 2 weeks after I got back from that trip, the same organization could not find language to put my name on what I had built. That is not a Derek problem specifically. Derek is just a particular species of middle manager that every large organization seems to generate through some process it has not figured out how to interrupt. The person who learns early that proximity to production is more valuable than production itself, who positions themselves between the work and the audience for the work, and who develops a structural interest in keeping that gap exactly as wide as it needs to be. The compliance, in retrospect, was not about punishing Derek. I am not sure I was even trying to make a point. I was doing something simpler and more honest than that. I was believing him. He told me what my job was. I did that job. If the implicit understanding had been that I was doing more than my job, that the additional work was expected but not compensable and not creditable, then I was operating under terms I had not agreed to. And when I removed my agreement, the terms became visible. The truth is, I loved the work. I loved building that department. I loved the people. I loved the feeling of a contract going from a mess to a mechanism, of watching a process run cleanly because someone had thought carefully about every point of failure. The money at the new job is better. The title is correct. The respect is real. But there is a specific kind of loss that comes from watching something you built continue to deteriorate in your absence, from knowing the exact repairs needed and understanding that they are no longer yours to make. I think about that sometimes, not with bitterness mostly, with something closer to clarity. Build things you can claim, document everything, know exactly what your job description says, because the day you need it to say something, you want it in writing and on the corkboard and absolutely unambiguous. And if someone tries to tell you that the work you built is not yours, believe them, step back, let the work introduce itself. It always does.